Hey, deserving listeners, Love is Blind, Season 8. Let's watch.
And I think I'm Christian and I'm making decisions, political decisions from my faith, so it might just be different. I think people should have abortion rights. You know, that type of stuff. I think gay people should have rights. All those things. So, and it's hard because all of those things are like becoming.
All right, so we're seeing another political conversation on the show, which makes sense. And I asked my contact, who didn't work on this season. She was working on season 9, which has yet to be aired, right? And apparently season 8, season 9 were being filmed at the same time, or at least there was some overlap. So she can't speak to anything that's happened this season. But I did ask her, generally speaking, from her recall on previous seasons, was there conversations about politics and religion that were not being included in the edit for whatever reason? And she said that she obviously doesn't know the answer to that question because she would only be keeping track of one couple or one individual's statements. But she did say and remind me that at the beginning of the day, the showrunner or some other person high up on the org chart will sit down with the cast in the pods at the beginning of every day and suggest different topics. The cast members don't have to delve into that in the pods, but it is an opportunity to remind the cast members that these sorts of topics can be explored and might be beneficial to explore. And religion and politics, I don't know how it's being presented to the cast, but my contact on the show said that those questions are often posed as possibilities. I think it also gives the cast in the pods an excuse to broach a topic that they might not normally, because they're trying to be polite or something. And so they could use it as an excuse. Okay, well, we're supposed to talk about this. So, and they really want to know, right? But I can't know. But anyway, so my contact on the show said that her sense is that this season isn't any different. Because that's what I was wondering is there seems to be an increasing amount of it in the show. It's still very little compared to, I think, how much people think about it, right? Religion particularly, because most people are religious in some way. So you would just think there would be some conversation. But she was saying that she doesn't think that this current season has any more or less than the other seasons, but she speculated that in all likelihood it's just because the conversations that were captured on camera on this season were more relevant to the overall storyline, and or there's just different ideas of what would play well to the audience, what they would want to see or what they're ready to see. Also, it's possible, this is just me speculating, that there's a general lack of drama in the cast members post pods, so they've got to show something, so they might as well show that. I don't know, that's just a guess. But I will highlight this conversation is interesting, and it started, I didn't show this, but it started out with them kind of reviewing the big picture about their relationship and heading forward to the altar. And they, in their very common, in their typical way, their vibe, they don't seem to have extreme amounts of displayed love and determination and vibe and chemistry. That doesn't mean they don't have love and chemistry. It just means that, at least to my eyes as one viewer of the show, they don't have it on display. I think that they both might just generally be that way. So maybe it's that. It's also possible that they just don't have chemistry or extreme love, but I can't tell. And then at some point, Virginia is saying, okay, well, ask me questions. And he's like, I don't have any questions. What do you mean? And they're not, I'm wording it kind of in a contentious way, but they weren't that way. It was casual. And she's like, I don't know. I just feel like there would be things that would be deal breakers for you. What would make you want to leave me? What would make you want to sleep in another bed? It was an interesting way of phrasing it. But essentially, I think what she's saying is, shouldn't you be more scrutinizing? Because I certainly have been. But I don't get the feeling like you are really thinking carefully about it. It's almost like you're just a long time ago just decided that you wanted to be with me, and you aren't revisiting that decision. Don't you want to revisit the decision? Don't you want to make sure? And on one level, that's the way it looks. But it's another possibility that he is locked in and he just doesn't make complicated decisions. Some people are like that. It's also possible that he just has never been in this scenario and doesn't know how to do that. It has the look that he isn't used to, or he isn't even considering those questions in a way that he probably should. I don't want to accuse him of anything, but it has the look of a younger person who just hasn't had the experiences that would give them the wherewithal to ask questions, and to not necessarily that you have a bunch of bad relationships in your past that you're trying to avoid in the present, but that you just understand that things could happen in the future, be revealed in the future, or could emerge in the future that would be a major concern, or at least some concern. Or also, as a parallel to this, if I were Virginia, I would be thinking, well, don't you have any sort of depth? Don't you have isn't there something there, or are you just this, I don't know, this like unquestioning, positive but shallow person, Are you just like, do you not think about things very often? Aren't you skeptical of your own emotions, or there's something there? Because everything that he says on camera anyway is just like, I love you. I'm even emphasizing, I love you. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. We share the same values. We have the same faith. Everything's good. And it could just be the way he expresses himself. It's not some indictment on the relationship that I am not getting a vibe. Who cares what my vibe is or what I'm picking up? It doesn't matter. It matters to them. Then they get into a conversation about politics. She introduced it, and I was watching, and they were talking. So she says, what about politics? And then he says, I don't think about it very much. So we've seen that before, right? He says that he just doesn't think about it, and it seems like overwhelming to him. He didn't say that word, but he just seemed like there's a lot to get into. Then we would wonder, or at least I wondered when Ben said that to Sarah in the pods, that he knows that there's a minefield there, either with Virginia or with the audience. That if he were to be honest about his political views, even if they were fairly unrefined, that he would be canceled or broken up with, right? That it would cause a problem. I would suspect there's some unsaid things by him. Now, can someone have a fairly limited understanding and therefore they just don't feel confident saying anything about politics? I suppose, but it's surprising and isn't typical. It'd be much more likely if someone responded this way that they had some level of political leanings and opinions, but they just don't want to share because they're worried that people are going to hate them or something, And I suppose that's a problem, right, in our society, that someone can't be honest about how they feel without being associated with horrific things. If someone isn't liberal, to assume that there's some sort of fascist, genocidal, racist, sexist, horrific human being is, of course, ridiculous. It's not strange, though, in our society to see people from both sides making such claims, right? And it's, can criticisms be waged? Yes. But these generalizations of an individual is just completely misguided. Anyway, so he is not saying anything. And then I thought we were just going to hear general things. She said that she generally votes Democrat. He didn't respond. Then she gives specifics, like she says that the right to abortion is something that she supports, and also that gay people have rights. I can't remember how she worded it, but she supports LGBTQ people, it sounds like. He doesn't say a single word. They are both pretty vocal about their faith. We've seen Devin respond to Britt in the pod, so I guess we're seeing another data point about how he feels about these things. It was unclear what he thought regarding bisexual people or dating a bisexual person. Certainly his response was not encouraging, but we can't know for sure. But given what we're seeing here, I would not be surprised if he were to fully talk about his point of view, if we would consider it to be highly bigoted. Now, would that be Devin's fault? I don't know, but it's certainly common, and it's very much pumped into people's heads. And there's a lot of misinformation and purposeful manipulation of the flock, the congregation or the followers of a particular branch of a religion, because in Seattle, the vast majority of Christians and Christian institutions in Seattle are LGBTQ allies, or their leadership is in the LGBTQ community. And they have the flag outside of their, the pride flag outside of their church, just perpetually there. So it's not Christianity. It's not a Christian tenet to be bigoted. I hope that makes sense. It's also not a Republican tenet to be bigoted. It often coincides, but certainly liberals can be bigoted. Anyway, this is not encouraging. Devin is not saying anything. I would assume he thinks the opposite. I would put a lot of money that he does not support gay people, that he does not support the women's right to choice. Because if he even slightly agreed, he would at least nod his head, right, as she lists these things up, but he's just staring at her. And yeah, it's now, I accept that there's a wide variety of opinions about this. Can someone be anti-abortion but vote differently? Yeah, it's not typical, but certainly someone can say, well, it's not my personal point of view, but I'm not going to vote against women's rights or the right to abortion. I'm going to continue to advocate that people don't, there's various different nuances, but anyway. So I'm going to take a guess and say that Virginia will not be surprised if he thinks differently, given the way that Virginia has presented up at this point. But I don't know, she's putting her flag, she's definitely saying, I believe in this and I believe in that. It's not just this general word of faith or this general word of justice or something. She's saying specific viewpoints and specific policies. So I wonder what's going to happen here.
Conversations again, when it's like I thought we were so far past that, but we're not. So it is an interesting time to live in the United States.
Yeah, just chiming in. I couldn't have put it better myself, Virginia. I thought we were past these things as well. I thought we were way past it, but clearly we are not. I mean, I knew that everything wasn't perfect and we weren't in a post-racial society. I for sure understood that, but I thought at least certain freedoms were a foregone conclusion that everyone agreed on, or at least enough people agreed on, but clearly not. I mean, I will say in my state of Washington, all of the freedoms have been retained, so I'm happy about that. I should say not all the freedoms, but the ones anyway.
I kind of go back and forth, and I'm not really, I feel like women have, it's their bodies and what they want to do with their bodies, but I also think the man and the woman that the situation is happening, if she's pregnant and they're deciding what to do with it, it should be both. Both.
Okay. It depends on what he means by that, but I think most people would agree in principle. Now, what the law should be and what the rights should be is a different question. Sometimes when people say what he's saying, then all they're saying is that as a culture, we should value both parents' point of view, even though it's ultimately the woman's decision, right? Another avenue that can be taken from that point of view, which I wouldn't be surprised by, is someone saying, and therefore the man should have total power over whether or not a woman gets an abortion or not, that sort of thing. So there's that. Should we have a conversation about that? For sure, right? And should we have conversations about helping to educate people and giving people free access and easy access to birth control and information? And yes. Should we be teaching abstinence only, and that's the only thing we teach kids? No. That's data indicates that is harmful in a number of levels. It increases unwanted pregnancies and teen pregnancies. Anyway, so he's answered the question. I didn't know if he would. Unlike Ben, at least in the edit, he just avoided the whole thing. So at least he's saying how he feels. I wouldn't be surprised if he did have a more conservative point of view and he's trying to be pleasing, because I would have imagined if the way he's describing it sounds like it's possible that he is in alignment with her point of view, but a shade off a little bit, or there's an asterisk. I would have assumed that if he was from that position, as soon as she talked about it, he'd be like, oh yeah, totally. I totally agree. But he didn't do that, right? Which is, I don't know. I don't know. What do you think? And I don't know how Virginia feels about it. It kind of seemed like Virginia, as I was predicting, that she did not necessarily think that Devin would agree with her. And the fact that she had thought that, and she's probably been thinking about that for a while. Although, I don't know, because she headed into this conversation saying, hey, you should be asking me if there's any deal breakers. Was that her way of getting the deal breaker conversation going? I don't know. It doesn't look like that.
I think ethical and moral thing to do is to communicate with your partner about the possible life. But I think that regardless, women should have the choice to do what they want with their bodies. Mm-hmm. So we're in alignment on that?
Yeah.
So we're going to vote the same when we go to the polls, or different? What do we take from that?
Okay. So at least on paper, they're in alignment on that point, at least in the broad strokes. I'm not confident that Devin is being completely forthcoming. But I don't know. Devin doesn't tend to be forthcoming about much, so who knows. But to go from that to exactly how you vote that's a leap, right? One can have that point of view and vote in a variety of ways. Whether or not you would say that's a legitimate way of voting or not, that's up to you to decide. But let's see what he said. I'm guessing he's okay. So the interesting bit here, regardless of the topic, is he going to answer truthfully or in a way that seems to exhibit truthfulness? That is he going to be honest?
If we voted differently, what would that mean to you? You wouldn't be okay with that?
Well, that's not a great question, or it's a response to her question. And there was an edit there, but that's not a great response, right? Because if she says, well, it's kind of a big deal to me, well, then given especially his behavior up until this point, regardless of this particular conversation, everything, then if I were Virginia and as a citizen watching the show, I would be very skeptical about how forthcoming he would be after she said that, right? If she said, well, it's a big deal to me, and then he says, I completely will vote liberal just like you. Well, in fact, just him asking that question is in line with a very tentative hypothesis that he is not really thinking about whether or not he wants to be with her. I don't know if that's true, but if it were, I wouldn't know where that was coming from, whether it was just he's not used to thinking about what he wants, or he thinks of her as such a catch compared to what he might think he's typical of attracting, that he's just in this state of being a pleaser and putting himself in the back burner, which is not a recipe for success. I don't know. What do you think? It's hard to tell, but it's had that look to it. And I don't know if I've said it, but I've been thinking it.
We voted differently. What would that mean to you?
I'd be okay with it. I think we should just talk about it more.
Right.
I think some of them are just like really big topics, you know? Like, I think it would be kind of alarming if you were just way on the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Okay. So, yeah, I can respect that. You know, I think there's a wide variety of responses from either that at least I, as a citizen watching, would say would be encouraging or something I could relate to. As a therapist, I've treated people all over the political spectrum, and it's my professional and ethical responsibility to not let my own personal views interfere with how I see them and how I treat them. And I have been seeing an alarming number of therapists, at least the way that they talk in consultation or the way they talk online, indicating they don't value that the way that they used to. It's a very well understood ethic and standard of practice and just way of being a professional clinician that our primary responsibility is to do no harm and to try to help. And when it comes to personal politics, and, you know, people make arguments about justice and about how can one just be silent about bigotry. And I will absolutely have those conversations. I, as a professor, as a therapist, as a novice therapist, I ran into it. This happens frequently, particularly now, but particularly in the past. I mean, depending on where you are as a therapist. I mean, I'm a therapist in Seattle, and I only treat people in Seattle, meaning that I don't do online therapy with people outside of Seattle. And so I will almost always come across people that are basically 99% in alignment with how I see things politically, or at least the things that come up in therapy seem to indicate that. So I don't really have to face this very often, but I did in the beginning of my career. And one of the things that I remember running into was I had a racist father. There was a dad and single father and two teenage daughters. And I won't go into detail, but he was being racist. He said some racist things that were pertinent to the therapy. But even if they weren't, I just made a judgment call that I had a good enough relationship with the dad, and also didn't want the daughters to just see me at least not push back on what he was saying. And so I pushed back. And I predicted correctly that our relationship was strong enough to handle me confronting him and saying essentially that he was wrong about his point of view. And I gave him reasons as to why he was wrong, and I might have even labeled it as racist or bigoted or something. And, you know, he heard it. He wasn't necessarily convinced, but at least in front of the teenage girls, I modeled how to talk about that, and I was communicating to the daughters that I absolutely did not agree with his attitude and his point of view, and labeled it as such. And so I use that example in a more elaborate description with my students and supervisees, my trainees, as a moment where I had given it a lot of thought up until that point. Where is that line? When do I involve politics, so to speak? It's not really politics, it's the thing. You know, when I think of politics, I think of budget cuts and big government, small. You know, there's different ideas about how a government should operate, this sort of thing. But when it comes to scientifically demonstrated bigotry and bias and harm and systemic problems that are very measurable in our society, whether it be income or redlining or immigration policy, there's obvious things that you can point to. Now, not every claim from the left is supported by science, but the biggies are, the broad strokes are. Does that apply to every human being? No. But when you aggregate the entire society, there's noticeable differences, Like there was a seminal study in Seattle, this was a long time ago, like 15 years ago or something, that they looked at all the police stops, or I can't remember the language, but it was a very important study around the United States that was used to understand how policy or culture of a police force in a particular jurisdiction can result overall with an effect that was shown in the data that when a person of color, I think maybe particularly black people, the Native Americans that were stopped by police for whatever reason, whether it was a traffic stop or trespassing or something. And don't quote me on any of this because it's that those suspects or those citizens approached by the police were treated much worse and faced worse treatment and more likely to be charged, more likely to be sent to, the sentencing would be more severe, all that kind of stuff. Don't quote me on that, but it was something in that category. And it was very clear from the data. And you don't have a measurable, significant effect with those kinds of effect sizes randomly. Now you can, it can be random, and there can be external factors that you're not accounting for, and science will try to account for those confounding factors, like income level or education level or some other factor that might be related to bigotry or racism or classism, but isn't directly a result of the police force being generally more racist or whatever. And it's hard to tell, but my point is that it's not a political thing. Now, what do we do with that might be a political thing, right? To eliminate the police force might be a particularly political point of view. Another would be to reform. Another would be to say, hey, you can't really do much about it. There's different ideas about what one should do, but there are facts. And, to say it's political anyway. So I don't know why I'm going down this rabbit hole, but why did I even start going down that rabbit hole? I wonder, because there was a lot of talk online from what I could tell about Ben and Sarah about a very similar conversation. Now, maybe because he has at least said something about his point of view, and maybe a lot of people would say, well, that's not as much of a problem or something. Maybe there's less. Now, the other thing is these episodes just came out like 5 days ago for me in my timeline, meaning that the wedding episodes haven't, or the wedding episode hasn't been posted yet. So maybe I just don't know. Maybe people are reacting against Devin in the same way they would have been. I don't know.
I don't know.
My dad's black, so.
No, I'm not talking about your dad. I'm just saying in general. I think that plays a role. I'm not going to keep beating this horse. Any other topics that we need to talk about?
I can't really think of anything right now. Mm-hmm. Do you have anything else you...
Yeah, we're seeing an edit, I think, and it's another moment in which he isn't exhibiting any internal questions or internal need to investigate their relationship or her, or an internal drive to really figure out if they're compatible. Now, I suppose there's a possibility that he has decided a long time ago that they're never going to get married, and therefore why look into something that is going to end soon anyway. It doesn't look that way. So I don't know if that's just his personality or it's this particular relationship or he's shy on camera. But it kind of looks like for Virginia, she's starting to want to at least go deeper into topics that are not being brought up naturally, which I think is a good impulse. Yeah, I don't know.
Want to talk about that we haven't?
Mm-mm.
No?
Not that I can think.
And I will say, as a jumping off point, I've treated a lot of couples where they had a similar dynamic in which one of the members tended to be not forthcoming with their thoughts, or they didn't seem to have that internal drive to question or to want to get real with someone. I don't know how to describe it. Similar to the way Devin kind of presents in this way. And for the Virginias of the world, it can feel distancing. It can feel like the other person isn't invested. They're not leaning in. They're not putting themselves on the line, because if you were doing that, you would think that there would be more investment, more emotion, more reactivity, more questions, more worry, whatever. Instead of this sort of blank, I'm all good, everything's good. And for some people, they're just really mellow, and it's possible that Devin is like that. But sometimes it's an indication of something. Either he is just so smitten by her that he's the type of person that when he's smitten, he doesn't really want to threaten anything. So he's like avoiding even thinking about such things as to whether or not they're a compatible partner for each other. But another possibility is that he just has not been given the chance to think about who he is and what he wants. So I don't know. I will say it is notable. I don't know if I included this clip, but he basically said that his parents are a lot more conservative. I mean, I guess that's what he's saying than he is, but that isn't really what he's saying. He's saying his parents are conservative. It's unclear where he would be categorized, right? Definitely more conservative than Virginia, seemingly. So anyway, I was going to say there's a possibility that he does have his own personhood, his own individuality, as evidenced by potentially not completely agreeing with everything that his family says or everything that his congregation says. But I can't say that because he didn't really go into detail. So, but anyway, I say this because if you have a partner or you are the individual who, regardless of whether or not if this is an accurate description of Devin, that you tend to hold back and be reserved, and you tend to be seen as easygoing, but you know that you're not actually that easygoing, it would serve you and the other person that you try to step into your agency and your feelings and your needs and your annoyances and your loves and all that kind of stuff. One of the barriers to that for people that are like this is that they think if they do assert themselves or they even think about what they want, it will cause problems and it will cause rejection, or it will inconvenience other people. It will mean that you're being annoying and pushy or something, even though you're far, far from that. If you were raised in a family that basically fostered that with you either directly or indirectly, where for you to just barely step into your agency was considered to be very pushy and self-centered and narcissistic or something, then these people tend to have a very skewed sense of what they should be doing and how much space they should be taking up, right? And breaking free of that is really hard. I've worked with a lot of clients who I will have long arguments about that for better or for worse, because sometimes the arguments will help and sometimes I'm engaging in my countertransference. I'm absorbing some aspect of their internal strife and fighting their fight for them. But anyway, they will be, it'll take a long time to change. The typical argument that I'm trying to get across to them is like, taking up space in a room or in a relationship or getting to know yourself and letting that actually sneak out in a relationship, revealing that in a trustworthy relationship is not you being a jerk face. It's not you being mean. It's not you taking up 100% of the space. You're only taking up 15% of the space, but it feels like you're taking up 100% because when you were a kid, you weren't allowed to take up 1% of the space. So it feels like because it is a big difference, but you've got a long way to go before you're 50%. And I'll tell clients this, that in my experience, even if you were completely on board and you didn't have all those barriers, and we worked on this and worked on this and worked on this, the most you could achieve would be a 40% in the roomness compared to other people, particularly people that tend to be comfortable taking up a lot of space. And these people tend to match up with people that love to take up a lot of space. In fact, for them to take up 50%, it feels like they're only getting like 30%, depending. So they can often attract and be attracted to people that take up a lot of space and need to take up a lot of space. And so it's even harder for them if they're in that configuration. Anyway, so I don't know about Devin, but just food for thought for y'all. All right, well, let's adjourn there. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.